Welcome everyone to another episode of Reflections on Health podcast. I'm here with Nick Dawe today. Nick has a master's of chiropractic, but he's not your everyday chiropractor. So Nick, can you tell me a bit about what you do?
Well, yeah, I'm bound by APRA regulations. I am a chiropractic practitioner. However, I choose to work a lot more with movement. My passion is particularly with neurodevelopmental movements that mirror and reflect and take someone back to the times in their neurological development where certain movements and certain parts of their brain were being formed, and create a task and an environment that's safe and accessible for them to go back into that, to relive and recode the parts of the neurology that maybe either weren't properly developed at that time, which is becoming increasingly common, or were properly developed and subsequently, by virtue of something or another, taken off the menu for them to use for their functional movement, their smorgasbord of movements and capacities in their body to achieve everyday tasks and even more specialized tasks that they may be yearning to do in their life, high-end sport, for example. And any time where they're not able to spontaneously and organically just do what they want to do and see a return on investment from that, we often see that there's a rigidity strategy present there, i.e. their body has chosen a defensive strategy for something or another somewhere in their body. And that rigidity strategy has vast consequences for that ambition of that spontaneous and organic growth and or just joy in movement. So I've found over the years in clinic that by going back and checking for the presence or absence of these functions, we can start to go all the way back to the start of that journey, plug them back into those capacities and watch that flow through, often just by itself, into whatever they want to do. And in some instances, we choose to hold their hand all the way through that journey. But that's a broader health ecosystem. That's sounding more like the Biotra approach that I'd love to talk to you about as well, if you've got the bandwidth and the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Let's start here. Let's break this down a little bit, because I think that was a nice big umbrella view. But we'll have to explore that a little bit closer. So you said neurodevelopmental movements. What are they? Just nice and simple. We'll wrap our head around all these concepts.
Yeah, totally. These movements start. So fundamentally, your brain is built as a loop. So the brain is a middleman of sorts from arriving information that any environment and yourself, your internal environment, provides it. And then the brain perfectly and proportionately makes a movement as a result of that arriving information. Now, this starts all the way back as an embryo. It starts very early. We know certain reflexes are matured as early as the 5th and 6th week in utero. And they go on segmentally and proportionately to then provide the platform for later movements, all the way up to when we're moving as complex bipedal adults, with all of that as assumed. So when we say neurodevelopmental movements, we're talking about any movement in that progression of learned movements that may happen or not happen based on circumstances, but are fundamentally meant to happen to humans as a species in the environment that we've found ourselves living in.
So kind of like milestones that a baby might go through.
They're pretty good approximations of these sorts of things that people look for. And the only interesting thing to pull out of that is that fundamentally every baby has the same sort of toolkit in terms of the development. That's why those milestones can exist. And there's some leniency with them. Obviously, everyone is slightly different and circumstances are different for everybody. But fundamentally, we seem to be born with this innate toolkit to learn and procure the appropriate amount of movements that later set us up to be functional humans.
Yep. So you're saying there's sort of this innate progression that we have through particular reflexes and movements.
Yeah, well, they start reflexively for sure, and then they later end up predominantly being reflexive, but having some sort of predictive prowess in the new brain that we have, that we develop through that period of time, where we can appear to have volition about what we are choosing to do. We can appear to have control over what we are choosing to do. That's a more philosophical argument. We could pull that apart, but for all intents and purposes, that's a nice entry level in understanding the interface between the subconscious parts of our movement, which are many, and the conscious parts of our movement, which are few. However, as practitioners, particularly in the movement sector, we tend to focus excessively on the conscious element of those movements, when really they're very small shareholders compared to the subconscious elements, which are almost exclusively forgotten.
So how would you get to those subconscious elements of movement?
Well, that's a great question. And the way that we do it at the moment clinically is using the OOF, the device that's in the backdrop for you there, which I know you're very proficient in using and I know you're very fond of. But essentially, if we pull out the capacities of the OOF is wonderful because it's ready-made. We've got it really calibrated, really dialed in. It's somewhat of a control for someone's development, but really instability and a situation where someone thinks they're going to get a certain outcome and the information that is available in their body demands a different or a review process or a different outcome. That's really the sort of the parameters that we're looking for. And to add to those parameters, when we're dealing with deep brain structures like brainstem and spinal reflexes, the person also has to feel safe, be safe materially, but more importantly, feel safe and be comfortable. So that narrows your list of tenable options down from existing unstable tasks where the consequences are significant if someone pushes their strategy to the max. And it's right at that maximum point of their strategic capacity that the review process takes place in. And so any unstable surface needs to also meet that criteria that somebody needs to feel safe, be safe, and be right at their strategic capacity in order to cajole them into that review process, which is ubiquitous. It's through the entire system, and it is deeply, deeply subconscious. And one of the most gratifying things is with a sort of a well-established mover trying to gain control over parts of their body that they do not have any conscious access to, and they get initially penalized for doing so when they're on the OOF. They're trying to brace, they're trying to control things, they're trying to use their breath in a conscious manner, and the instability of the OOF then makes them feel more unstable. Eventually they have to relinquish that demand for control and surrender themselves to the absolute wisdom of their subconscious movement capacity and let that come through. That's the wisdom in everybody's body, and everybody has it. We've just got to figure out really refined ways of getting people into it reliably and safely, and I think we've done a pretty good job by doing that with the OOF.
So it's got to be hard and they've got to be wobbly.
Yeah, basically, while still feeling safe and comfortable. And remember, like when you're supine or prone, so on your tummy or your back, not respectively, the other way around, on the OOF, your very first terrestrial movements were developed on the ground. And so it's an essential part of taking someone back to early movement strategies, if that's where we need to go with them. And, you know, clinically, I see that very often. So I'm happy just to leave that as a sort of a starting point there, that we ought to go back to, if not uterine strategies, interuterine strategies, then very early terrestrial strategies.
What would an interuterine strategy be?
We're starting to talk more about the fluid body there and fluid movements in someone's body, which as an adult extends to the management of their 11 different pH systems. But at its most rudimentary, it's really the movement of fluid in their central sort of column, the cerebrospinal fluid is what it's called. And if that's not lively and well and moving in a rhythmical manner within certain parameters of amplitude and frequency, then that person's movement complex after that point will take some degree of impoverishment into it and have to compensate for that for a really long time until that compensation starts to break down. And that would be an example of a interuterine sort of developmental strategy, those fluidic movements.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you say people will be on their tummy, on their back, and that would be sort of the positions that we're in as babies and learning to develop from there.
Yeah, well, the idea goes that you don't have readily available spinal tone at that point. And so you're moving your arms and your legs and your head sort of reflexively, involuntarily, and those movements are sending impulses back into the central nervous system through that fluid medium, creating vibrations all the way up to the brainstem, and then beyond, up above the brainstem, starting to print and learn and establish the parts of the brain that will later assume some sort of control over those movements by virtue of inhibiting them. And the opposite end of the spectrum is when someone loses the ability to inhibit those movements, and those movements start to come back and start to cause a problem in someone's functionality, like Parkinsonian presentations or any sort of cord damage, and we see contraction or extension and no control over that, no ability to inhibit that movement and integrate that into a coordinated global sequence that allows us to move and function and behave as humans, right?
So as we develop, there's things that can inhibit or sort of impact moving through each developmental stage.
Yeah, be careful with the word inhibit, because we're using that in two different contexts. We're using the same word. On the one hand, there's this really necessary inhibition of involuntary movements that's required in order to stop them and release them at the appropriate time in the appropriate sequence for a purposeful task. And then we're talking about inhibition in the external vernacular, where something might block that process from taking place. And those things are numerous, and we've got more of them now than probably we had before, but that could be debated. That's my viewpoint. It's one shared by many, but still there would be room for debate.
Yeah, a lot of things are.
Oh yeah, that's the spirit of things, you know. Yeah. But just before you move on, when we put someone back onto the floor as adults, if they don't have that instability underneath them, they just take their adult learned spinal tone and they put that on the floor. So you may be able to learn a new task that looks like a primitive movement on the floor as an adult. But unless you have the instability there, demanding the review process of all the levels of the spine, you won't in fact go back to the same coding that built the brain in the first place. You'll just be developing a new movement on the ground as an adult, which is debatable for its usefulness.
So you're not quite getting to those deep brain regions, the subconscious regions, and sort of relearning or rewiring and repatterning.
Yeah, I like nourishing. I use the word nourishing a lot. I use the words blind spots and nourishing a lot, as opposed to what's commonly used in the industry, because what's commonly used assumes that there's a problem there, and I don't agree with that as a starting point philosophically.
What would you assume? What would your philosophy be?
Nothing. I assume nothing. And I think that's one of the great sort of gifts of humility, is let their body declare to them and me simultaneously what it is that their body wishes us to see. And that's the entry point into, okay, well, this is what it looks like. This is what it feels like to you. Let's do this task, and then we'll go back and see if that thing felt or looked different. And if it does, and it feels better, and it follows through to standing posture or respiratory strategies subconsciously without having to try and teach someone the impossible of standing better or breathing in a different way, then I think we've got a good outcome. And moreover, we've got a strategy that doesn't require a practitioner to maintain that. We can then hand the keys of the kingdom back to them, and they can do it for the obligatory time period before that becomes the new status quo and becomes automated in their brain and becomes part of their extensive toolkit to draw on for any movement that they wish to do. Super cool.
Absolutely.
But you can see how different it is to trying to teach someone to stand right or breathe right whatever that means. And, you know, one of my great joys, which you may have experienced, and is when someone does the prone work and reestablishes their pressure and their deep extensor spinal tone. And then they stand up. And I'm talking about practitioners. I'm talking about people that are professionals in posture. And they stand up and you say, how do you feel? They say, good. You go, what does that mean? What does good mean? They're like, I don't really have words for that. I feel really good. I don't know what it is. And like, well, what are you trying to tell people what to do? Like, how are you not able to even provide the framework of language around your own kinesthetic experience yet every day? You're trying to use another kinesthetic experience that wasn't quite that. And then kick that over the ether to that person who has a different kinesthetic experience, maybe even a different representational map of reality. Maybe they're visual or auditory, not kinesthetic at all. And trying to get them to then do something kinesthetic that way, like that's a big task. And people do it. It has worked in the past. It just doesn't work enough for it to be considered the only path forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you mean if someone sort of doesn't quite get the same input from inside their body, doesn't quite know how to interpret that information as well as, say, outside inputs?
What I meant by that, even though that's a valid comment and we could go down that path, what I meant by it is people seem to have, despite having all available inputs, unless there's some reason why they don't have those inputs, everybody has all of those available input capacities, particularly to the brainstem. But when whatever circumstance shape our development, people tend to preference them in an order of how they show up to the world. So some people see the world, some people hear the world as their preference. Everybody does everything. And some people feel the world, and the feelers are the ones that we say are kinesthetic. So they're the ones that maybe you say, hey, I really want you to feel this. And they may be able to interpret that language and transmute that into a feeling and activate the right thing. But by the time you get to there, you're talking about a very small percentage of success. And I think we've got another way now where we tap into everybody's subconscious kinesthetic, irrespective of their preference on how they view the world, subconsciously. And it doesn't matter if they have the words for it or the experience for it. It's just doing what it's meant to do and what it was always meant to do, right?
Absolutely. So if somebody's got these sort of developmental impacts, what does that look like as an adult? How does that kind of show up?
Invariably, luckily we have a solid answer for this, because that could be a very ambiguous answer. Invariably, we see certain things emerge in their body. And that's just so lucky, because then we can know for sure that we're starting to go down this path. And then it splits into a million paths after knowing that we're going down the path, because we then have to figure out where in the million options we want to go to nourish that. But they often show up, well, they invariably show up with a rigidity strategy, which consists of three things, and with I say a floating fourth. The first one is compression. And with compression, because of the spinal mechanics, courtesy of Sergei Grakovetsky's work, we understand that it has an axial torque just by virtue of the engineering of the spine. So we compress and we axially torque, and that bit's really significant. We'll come back to that. But with that axial torque, we then get horizontal shearing. And the body doesn't really like that, so then it protects itself against that in the local areas that was subjected to the horizontal shearing, and it then just re-invokes the same thing: compression, axial torque, and horizontal shearing, until finally there's enough stability there. Whatever the tax on that stability is yet to be ascertained. That may be osteophytic development, it may be a disc, whatever. Nonetheless, that's the strategy that the body takes in order to try to maintain functionality with a tax, when there was another system that allowed them to do that with greater efficiency and greater ease, right up until the point where they needed to invoke that strategy again, right? So it's just like these recursive loops. And the floating fourth is that the diaphragm gets embroiled in that very readily as a trunk stabilizer. And then all of a sudden we start to see not just the mechanical outward facing issues emerge, for example, asymmetry in the limbs, in terms of how the limbs function by virtue of that axial torque. Physios, chiropractors and the like are forever telling people that their pelvis is out or their shoulders are out or whatever. And that's just a natural byproduct of the fact that their body has tried to find stability through those three means. But then when we throw the diaphragm in the mix, then we start to consider these, dysregulated states of various pH systems in the body. So we start to see digestive, not just from neural and mechanical, but also from this now chemical pathway. We start to see, my colleague Roger Price is fond of saying that 11 to the power of 11 is just shy of 40 million prospective symptoms complexes emerge from just making that one choice. It's not a conscious choice, don't worry. And we start to see also this massive corroboration loop, because we take a huge amount of breaths a day, basically as a given. And so the longer you spend in that strategy, taking those breaths, the more the body becomes fond of and familiar to being in that strategy. So then it makes the likelihood of affecting a low-level creditor like a shoulder or a rotator cuff or an adjustment to the pelvis extraordinarily unlikely to hold. It's good for business, but it's really bad for the patient's kind of ethics, right?
Readjustment, sort of manual therapy designed to kind of realign the space, I suppose, and having a limited long-term effectiveness on that.
Yeah, I mean, anybody listening will probably have some story that they can draw on for themselves as to feeling really good post-treatment and then it relapsing very rapidly within a day or two, or sometimes even sooner, back into the way it was. And that's just because the body put it there purposefully in the first place for a reason. And then the practitioner, playing God of sorts, just said, well, I don't like where that is. I think you can be better if I put that in the right spot for you. And then the brain just goes, no, I actually had that pretty well dialed in, actually. I'm pretty competent here at knowing what I need. So I'll just whack it straight back. And okay, that's a pretty good outcome. There's not great danger in that. It's poor in terms of efficacy, but it's not super dangerous. But on occasion, the body can go, oh my God, that was my only strategy. And now you've forcibly taken that away, third party. I don't have a strategy anymore, bang, and there we see the big collapse. Okay, it happens the same way with sort of exogenous substances in sort of pharmaceuticals and those sorts of things. Everything has its place. Everything has its sort of rightful place in the system. It just becomes a problem when we lose that fluidity and very rapid sort of diagnostic dance with the person, and we try and assume a framework with their body and make everything fit that framework. That can become a little dogmatic and a little bit like a rigidity strategy that we're talking about in the body.
Yeah, absolutely. Treating symptoms and not causes, or what's at the heart of what's making this show up.
Yeah, but be careful with that, because I hear a lot of rhetoric around let's get to the root of this. Let's get to the beginning. Man, that's as an erroneous notion as ever. It's it's very, very difficult to find that earnestly. You may agree on it with the person in front of you. You may be satisfied collectively with what that looks like for them, and that might feel good on another level of that interaction, that relationship. But man, I think it's better just to assume the body's doing the right thing and to nourish it in a way that seems pragmatic for it and responds favorably, and then to keep that dance going and give that person the ability to go on with that dance in a really broad and nourishing way. And that's why just the manual therapy and the rehabilitation really ought not stand by itself. That's why it has to be put into a broader health ecosystem. And so with the Biotra approach, Nathan, Ryan and I have basically woven together modern biophysics and an understanding of modern biophysics, a non-dogmatic psychospiritual framework for people to connect back into deeper truths that everyone's kind of yearning for one way or another, and also apply things that we're talking about here, but in their particular order and in the particular proportion, without blowing their importance out of proportion for someone, with all the other physically nourishing sort of elements that one might reasonably need in order to be a well-balanced and functioning human able to live a graceful, joyous life.
So how do they interweave together?
Well, I mean, originally the brief was I approached Nathan and I said, mate, look, I'm a big believer in what's emerging in the biophysics landscape. I think it really holds a lot of the keys, but you've got a big problem. One, no one does it. And secondly, the people that do it are so weird that they immediately alienate everyone around them, including friends and family, so that everyone just goes, oh my God, what happened to Jeff? Like, I'm not wearing those glasses. I'm not doing that thing, you know? And so I said,
can you explain what biophysics is to me?
well, it's the physics of biology in, just to reverse the word, which is basically a sort of a deeper understanding, and I would say a more generous to the consumer understanding of how the body works, because the chemistry world is highly organized as a veil that a normal person can't step back through. If you don't understand the biochemical pathways, all those wheels, all those spokes, you are really liable to abuse from the practitioner class to tell you what's wrong with your body based on some notion and provide you with something that you have to pay for that purports to remedy that chemical imbalance. And it is so complex, it is so convoluted, it's so delicate that I'd say you can get lucky, but on the whole, it's not really that efficacious. But when we pull back through that chemical veil, you know, biochemistry is chemistry that's been applied, and chemistry is physics that's been applied. And so if we can get people down, and curiously enough, on the physics level, everything becomes cheap, everything becomes free, everything becomes universally available for people. But there's so much momentum behind the chemical movement that people are almost in disbelief that really simple, low-hanging fruit changes to their life can yield a really dramatic, helpful outcome. Now, that's not to say you don't need then a specialist in the chemical framework to then pull you through that. There may well be a particular deficiency that still exists after you go and do your due diligence at the physics well. And that's where the practitioners come back in. And that's amazing. And that's what a great relationship. But I'd say we can give back a lot of the power back to the consumers with a few very simple pieces of information, and they can start to get back a lot of their wellness and their control over their journey that way. And so I said that to Nathan, and I said, mate, you know, the biophysicists kind of realized this and they got a little insecure. And so what they started to do, instead of trying to make it more motivating and attractive for people, they went the other way and they built this, you know, ivory tower of academia that was just the same as the chemical one. Like, now no one can understand the biophysics anymore because the people preaching from the top either say it in such a way that's completely inaccessible unless you have tertiary physics, or it's so simplified that it's so unbelievable and unmotivating that people don't do it. So I challenged him. I said, mate, you need to sit in the middle. You need to be the guy that delivers the middle product to people. And moreover, we need to attach it to something where people already have a deep belief of goodness, and that's a physical regime. So when we do the physical regime in Biotra, it is hand in hand with the biophysics interventions that are most appropriate for each step of that sort of physical nourishment strategy, and people don't have to know about it. So if someone comes in from a biophysics standpoint, they get the physical and they get the spiritual. Someone comes in from the spiritual, vice versa, and so on and so forth. So it's done to weave together a practice, a health practice, and a health strategy that people can start to access safely by themselves, for themselves, and start to see where they could go.
Do you have like a practical example of what one of those interventions would look like?
Yeah, totally. We spoke, and just to pull it back to our conversation so it's not just left of field, we spoke about the fluid body earlier. Well, when you cool fluids, you increase their density to 4 degrees, which is the specific density of 1 with water. We're not going to go to 4 degrees, and that's an erroneous misinterpretation of using cold. But when we gently cool the fluids in someone's head, we increase the purposefulness of that central column of fluid that I mentioned before. And then we pair that with a specific movement sequence that then allows the neural tube to develop its relationship and its flow. And then we push the fluids from their poles, from the head to the pelvis and then back. and it's quick, and it's cheap and cheerful. And all of a sudden we've combined biophysics with movement to bring back online someone's fluid body at the first step before we even try to develop spatiotemporal mapping or sensory motor richness or motor control or reflexes, because all those things required the fluid body in the first instance. And so why wouldn't we go and put that in the right order, in our opinion, you know? That's one example, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So you would do similar kind of movements and working on the fluid in somebody's body, which is not something, I think that's completely foreign concept to.
It is to everyone except the sort of the cranial osteopathic movement, right? And some other branches. But the problem with the cranial osteopathy is that it's you go and lay on a two-dimensional surface under bad lights, probably with the Wi-Fi in the background, and you get told whether your fluids are good or not. And then you get a very delicate, I think it's very potent, but nonetheless, I'm just talking from the consumer's standpoint. You get a very delicate intervention, and then you're left at the mercy of the practitioner telling you that that's a healthy system or not at the end of that session. And then you go straight back into the environment, straight back into the same movements and the same biophysical landscape that probably shut them down in the first instance. So it needs to be richer, it needs to be broader, and it needs to be without the overwhelm, and it needs to be cheap, and it needs to be universally accessible. And that's now we're starting to talk about healthcare. That's starting to shape up to something that's useful for this enormous weight of suffering and disease that we're facing right now as a species.
Yeah, absolutely. So is this something that you're doing at the moment in practice?
Well, so I've got two caps, right? So I have to be a client-facing clinician within certain guidelines and parameters. And then I'm Nick, who wants to see everybody, if they choose and if they feel called to it, have the appropriate access and resources to feel better in themselves. And so on the one hand, in the clinic, I would be probably manually and on an educative level sort of proactive for the fluids, but not practically proactive for the fluids in the way from the biophysical standpoint that I just said. And then I would be very practical with respect to the reflexes and the spatiotemporals and the sensory motor element. And then with the Biotra stuff, then obviously we've got the ability to put the fluids front and center and then follow up quickly after with the spatiotemporal and the reflexes, and then quickly after that with the control and the pressurization of the various cavities that all reverse that compression of the rigidity strategy. Then after that, we can use other tools to tune and nourish the sort of the ancestral morphology of the upper and the lower limbs. And then after that, we can develop the sequences and the rhythm that people would need in any of their later movements. You know, if we look at the thoracic spine, for example, how many thoracic spines do you or your practitioners and colleagues treat, right? Heaps. Well, the thoracic spine needs a couple of really significant pieces of nourishment. It needs a combination of space, we'll call that mobility just for the common language. It needs stability or control, and then it needs rhythm and sequencing, because if it just has mobility and it doesn't have the sequencing, then the mobility gets abused and we've got shearing forces. If it just has the stability without the mobility, we call that stiffness, and they might be really good under a back squat or under a sprint, but then, you know, at their 30,000th breath that day, bending over to pick up the kids, then their facet joint's liable. And so goes the saga. And all of those things need underneath them, they need the pressurization so that the pleural cavity is nice and expanded and this incompressible sort of sphere of gas. And underneath that, we need to get rid of the potentially hundreds of thousands of triggers per day that would cause them to go back into their rigidity strategy, because they've learned to be that way in some instances for decades, and their eye movements and their tongue movements and their head movements all doing the same dance as that, or are on the same side as that rigidity strategy. I'm pushing pretty hard because I know you and I know what you can sort of, I know what your mind's like, but if you want to break that down, or you say it's not what you want in this chat, then pull it apart, you know?
Yeah. No, for sure. I think it was just, trying to break it down so that it's nice and usable for someone to get sort of a basic understanding of the concepts and kind of what's involved and sort of the reasons why certain approaches are working or what kind of effect they're having and at what level.
All right. Well, say you've got a trunk, and let's just use nice, easy numbers. You've got a anatomical potential of your spine to be 100 centimeters, but your trunk then gets compressed with all these fascial contractile fields down to 90 centimeters. Then what does the spine have to do? The spine has to deviate. It has to twist. It has to make a shape in order to conform to the container that it's given. And generally what we then ask someone to do in that compressed state is we either ask them to mobilize their thoracic spine hinging on that compressed state, or we tell them that we're going to adjust them and that we need to see them a whole bunch of times based on that x-ray that just terrified them because they look like a corkscrew, which is just a normal rigidity strategy on the most half, right? And so wouldn't it make sense to anybody listening that if we could restore that container back to 100 centimeters, their spine's going to do a certain amount of that by itself? We're just talking about getting the order right in the approach and giving people back the ability to do that.
Absolutely. So the interventions, the reflex exercises, is that something that makes a permanent change, or is that something that people have to keep doing? What sort of that look like?
Well, the metabolic capacity of the deep spinal stabilizers are really significant. They're very, very resistant to fatigue. And so more often than not, one or a number of those faces to that container are off, causing the body to make a shape that later results in pain or asymmetry or whatever. And so once you restore the tone back into those deep spinal stabilizers, they're pretty resistant to change. But that doesn't happen once. I mean, sometimes it does happen once and stays, to be fair, and we only know that after the fact because people confess to not having done the homework, and somehow or another, you know, they've done the impossible, and it's still just the way we left it 6 weeks ago. But I wouldn't say that's the norm, just from my intuition. So generally, people have to do these exercises, if you're talking about the reflex ones, between sort of 2 and 8 minutes a day for roughly about 6 weeks for us to see the wood for the trees. And the reason is that the constant reminder of those exercises starts to be a combative force against the way that the body was doing things and has learned to do things. So we just kind of constantly just keep reminding it that there's another way. And then at that 6 week mark, it's said in some neurological literature that some architectural change starts to emerge in the pathways. And so we just use that as a sort of an abstract kind of cutoff point, and we generally review someone at that point and see whether their movement's progressed. Has their movement progressed? Their symptoms complex hasn't. Has the movement progressed? Symptoms complex has. Has the movement not progressed? You know, any different way, and that sort of gives you a second bit of data to then help that person as best you can.
Absolutely. Yeah, I had a story. I was doing some exercises pretty well for a few months, and then I stopped. And then it was actually helping my mood so much, and I didn't realize until I stopped. And then a month later, I was like, I'm just in the worst mood, like not just for a day, but multiple days, multiple weeks. And then I was like, do you know what I did? I stopped doing all these exercises. And then slowly it was kind of those changes got reversed. And then I started doing them again and felt much better. And yeah, it was just wild, the changes that really happened.
Well, all of the spinal reflexes appeal to the brainstem, which we think has a significant say in whether or not you feel safe. And so by the time that safety then gets catapulted up to the midbrain in the triune brain model, it then has the capacity to either allow you to be very present and peaceful or thinking about what might go wrong in the future. And then once it goes through that junction, it gets up to the new brain up the top, which makes meaning out of that. and goes, well, I don't feel good because, or if only I had this then. And all those sorts of phenomenon start to creep in way after the fact. So when you go back to that level of nourishment in your body at the sort of the spinal reflexes, then all of a sudden you're getting this rich flow of information basically constantly from all the proprioceptors up to the brainstem. The brainstem goes, I've got heaps of goodness here. Like, this world might be a really fun place to live. And then and the meaning making just does its thing, and it just goes, hey, how good's life,
Yeah, let's pull that out a little bit more, because you mentioned earlier that feeling safe when you're doing this is really important. So what I think it's going to be hard for some people to wrap their head around, like, how can we improve our mood with movement? How does that even correlate, and how does that sense of safety kind of come into it?
Yeah, amazing question, as I would expect. It's undeniable, the connection between things like posture and mindset that's been established very elegantly by a number of different domains in medicine for a really long time. And movement and posture share a lot of similarities. It's basically a response to a task, and posture is just considered to be more still than movement, which is considered to be more dynamic. But really, they're one and the same thing. They're a response, a proportionate response to the information that the brain has at its disposal. And so the better quality the information, the theory goes, the better quality the response to that information. So easier posture, easier movement, but the movement and the posture, they're the same responses on the sensory motor loop as generation of thoughts and mentation. And so the richer the information coming into the brain, the richer the formulation of thoughts. And if we have all the available evidence and all the richness that is really actually there, it's just very hard to find under certain circumstances, then most problems go away, physically and emotionally. And it's almost always some impoverishment somewhere caused by something internally or externally that eventually bubbles up to be an imbalanced viewpoint or an imbalanced movement strategy or something like that. So if we go back and we just think about this cleverly, then we go, well, the major sensory shareholders to the brain are the spine, the mouth, the eyes and ears, and the hands and the feet. If we can make them get heaps of quality information regularly, like nature intended, then probably that ends up manifesting in different movement patterns and different postural positions. And by extension, we're now making inferential comments. By extension, the hypothesis would be that the different postures and the different movements simultaneously change the mindset. But to be safe, let's just say that they're related over here. And so we make the movements better, the person may think better.
Yeah, for sure. It's, quite an amazing kind of link, and a really interesting way to sort of look at it, that it's not just thoughts or, the way you're looking at the world, and that it's a problem with, talking about it, and things can kind of help where, these things that we're not even considering can have such a massive impact.
Well, we've got this really strong kind of sense of self and this Cartesian notion that the thought, and the hierarchy starts at the head and then extends down. And quantum physics, any spirituality practice, anyone that's taken a hard path through movement or study or devotion would quite happily just go, look, I'm just not sure if that's the full picture. And yet that's the one that's just adopted at the moment and potentially is involved with the suffering en masse that we're experiencing. And one potential nourishment point as a solution may well be to increase the capacity of our movement and increase the coherence of our biophysical bodies, our fluid bodies, our electric bodies, our light bodies, and also provide the intellect and the top part of the brain, the sense of self, with a really handy framework that's really generous and tender towards ourselves and others and nature. That wouldn't be an outrageous comment to think that might be a nice, accessible and relevant map for someone to begin to follow to feel good.
Yeah, absolutely. Now you came up with a lot of these techniques, or sort of married a few of these and pulled from a few different places. Can you talk into that? Like, who's your mentors and how did you kind of put a lot of this together and come up with this sort of stuff?
Yeah. I don't fully know where it comes from, but from time to time, I get kind of blessed with these notions that may be of use, and then I start the process of pulling them down from that kind of etheric, intangible, all the way down until hopefully some of them get birthed into a practical, useful strategy for people. So that's generally how it goes. It often happens when I'm training or in the sauna or something like that. For some reason, that just must be where I'm in a really nice, coherent sort of pattern and these things can land. But the journey started all the way back. I've been very blessed with everybody that's been in my path. And the inventor of the OOV, an Australian guy called Daniel Vladeta, he invented the OOV, and he took me under his wing towards the later stages of his clinical practice, just at the beginning of mine. And so I got an enormous download of information. You can only imagine the type of genius that he is in order to formulate and bring to life something like the OOV. So I got that handed to me on a spoon, basically, straight out of the blocks. And then from there, I got the blessing of every single patient that doubles as a teacher for me to come through to just formulate and refine how we're using the OOV and how we're relating to people. And then on top of that, superimposed on top of that, there's these massive changes in what we were seeing through the eras. I've been practicing for about 15 years, and just about every fifth year, there's been a really significant difference in what we're seeing. And so the problem demands a solution. So then you go back into that same process that I described initially, and then something comes out that might be useful. I test it on myself. I test it on my athlete friends that train with me. Test on the family, and then all of a sudden it sort of sometimes pops its way into being able to be deployed in the clinic if it's proven its worth. And the reflexes, then borrowing Philip Beach's work, the contractile fields. When I was exposed to Philip Beach's work, it really made sense for the first time. There was an actual framework that helped to decipher what it was that we were already seeing on the OOV. And so then there was language, and then there was other details and other information there that he'd supplied that tracked it back into the embryology, which then opened the door for the reflexes. And then all of a sudden you've got all this kind of clinical sort of neurodevelopmental stuff happening at the same time as me trying to be as healthy as I can be and trying to have healthy friends and family. So formulating and pulling together all that stuff to do with the biophysics and the mind, and particularly into an athletic setting. And then all of a sudden you've got this kind of amalgamation of those two worlds coming together, and very quickly the things that aren't useful get dropped, because there's no place for inefficiency in the clinic. There's no place for inefficiency in elite sport. So you end up with these things. And then if those things are scalable or the same thing, then I think they've got that extra degree of corroboration that they might be useful for humans. And so then that's where Biotra was born,
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'll be looking forward to hearing kind of more about that for sure.
I think you're having Nathan on at some point, aren't you?
I am. So a couple of weeks I'll have a chat with him.
There you go. That'll be I'm gonna tune in for that one. I can't hear that guy enough, even though I've possibly heard nearly all of it over the last 10 years. I always like to hear how he says things. It's so motivating and cool,
Yeah, cool. It'll be completely new for me, new concept. So I'll be,
good.
It'll be good. How have these sort of techniques and things helped you personally? What have been some sort of experiences that you've had?
Well, I've always, my first half of my movement life was very escapist driven. It was a deep sense of not enoughness. That's very common to a lot of elite athletes, and so it was very much an adversarial relationship between my mind and its lacking, and my body to sort of come up and show up and sort of try to patch the holes in the mind, and eventually, forced with a change to find greater tenderness and love, which was really when I was blessed with my first child. Then the suffering of that elite athletic mentality came at loggerheads with this much more attractive love story. And so then I had to reconcile the two really quickly, because I knew in my heart there was a lot of goodness in that movement. I developed a lot of goodwill. I developed a lot of skills and a lot of lessons and a lot of teachers in sport and movement. But now there was this new framework. And so I had to really, really quickly make sure that those two were compatible and healthy to one another. And so here I am now, still using my body very significantly, very often, as a teacher and as a feedback tool and as an ongoing, loving, nourishing relationship for longevity and also appreciation of what I have right now in front of me. And so these things were really, huge gaping holes in my athletic body. And so when I started to plumb them in just on a whim, no path to follow, I invented it. So it was like, basically it was like, well, this feels good. I'll push this. Oh, I wonder what's after this. Oh, that's a bit harder. Oh, I wonder if I can ever do that. That seems really, I can do that now. I wonder what's after that. And so I've just seen this kind of like incredible pull through of really subtle body work on the fluids and the reflexes into all of those things that I already had as calibration and controls, these athletic expressions. So it was just a very easy scientific experiment to see the transfer from one point to another. And then the next task was, okay, well, I'm me, but that's not everyone's journey. So how can we develop this richness in sort of regressions and progressions so that everybody can jump on that train safely and start to experience that journey? And I had a couple of patients that were kind of like me in terms of their mindset and their sort of physical practices and those sorts of things. So after it took me years to develop, I was able to see how quickly they actually worked when they were fully formulated and structured in a plan. And so that's when I became really excited. I was like, oh, these things really work for other people really, really quickly. Whereas for me, I was kind of like, fuddling my way along, and it may or may not, it could have been other things that were coming in at the same time that led to the benefit. But now I know.
Yeah. Yeah, wow. So would you use them more for yourself in kind of a movement purpose and getting your movement and your body, I don't know, working better or working optimally, or more of a spiritual, emotional kind of thing, or just sort of everything together?
Oh, you like Biotra, Jackie, because you can't separate those things out. You can try initially, but at some point you'll realize that they're all on a beautiful spherical continuum. And so how I exactly use it is outlined very clearly in what we call in Biotra the core practice. And that core practice is a 5-step plan within a 9-step understanding of movement and where those 5 steps can take you, and all the potential things that can be nourished to fully enrich someone's physical body. And so those 5 steps look like this. We nourish the fluid body. I won't tell you how, it's not relevant for now. I'll provide you with the necessary links for the readers and yourself. We go through the fluid body. Then we do what we call the electric body, which is all the spatiotemporal eye-ear movements with the reflexes of those basic contractile field positions. And these are all very wordy. This is all for you. The reality is it's fully experiential. No one needs to know a single word about it. If they do it, they will just feel it. And that's that. That's all that matters, right? And then if they feel it enough, they might be motivated to go and read about it and learn about it and share that with the people that they love. And that's why the book's there and the courses and those sorts of things. But if you just want to feel it, you just follow the recipe. as much as it pains me to use the word recipe. And so we're in the electric body, we've got the sensory motor, we've got the spatiotemporal, we've got the reflexes, then we pull through to the control and pressure cavity body. And those two are very similar. So they're kind of linked together, but we delineate them for educational reasons, which are these big pressure cavities and these contractile fields in these kind of longer kind of postural demands. And then we go, well, now that we've gotten rid of the rigidity strategy, now it's a chance to nourish the arms and the legs in their spiralized and coiling capacity that they're meant to do when they work in nature under a raft of different tasks. And then finally we go, that's cool. Now everything's really nourished, but it's kind of nourished in somewhat of an isolated manner. So then we use other tools to pull that through in these kind of primordial rhythms and sequences. And really importantly, the rhythms and sequences are done at realistic speeds for what someone may then require their body to do. So one of my pet peeves is motor control that's done by necessity really slowly, and then hoping to run. Well, okay, sure, theoretically, motor control helps you run, but actually there's a whole bunch of stuff that can change in between doing something really slow on the ground, or an oeuvre or a reformer, really slow, and then asking all these ligamentous complexes and elastic modulus components of the body to work under completely different speeds, completely different metabolic demands. So we've got to hold its hand through, and that rhythm and sequences bit there is that kind of icing on the cake. We do things at a realistic speeds of throwing realistic speeds of trunk movement like we were doing a run or a jog, and so on and so forth. So that's the beauty in that total system, and the whole thing takes less than 30 minutes. So it can be a standalone practice by itself, or as I use it and many use it, as an activation sequence before then I paddle or I do my gym or something like that. So if you want it for just spiritual, mental health reasons, then it's a standalone practice. Do it outdoors, get the sun on your skin, get your feet on the ground. If it's safe to do so, yada, yada, you can read about it. Mm-hmm. And if it's part of an athletic strategy, then we do that and then go into something. If it's part of a rehabilitative strategy, then all of a sudden we can rehash or spend more time on the thing, the system, the domain that seems to be the most impoverished for that person at that time, and make sure that they're whole, their physical body is whole and nourished.
Yeah, perfect. You said there's a book. Is that your book?
Nathan and Ryan and I wrote a book over the last 3 years. We published it earlier this year. It's called Biotra, and currently it's available on most of those kind of online platforms just for print-on-demand reasons. For us, it's the most kind of efficient for us right now, and it's I think you really enjoy it. So thanks for expressing interest.
Yeah, no, that sounds really cool. How do you spell that? Biotra. Biotra. Yeah, nice. That sounds cool. Check that out.
Being the root word for change, travel, transcend, trauma, traverse, etc. And bio, obviously, being life. So how do we give people back a really nice, not overwhelming framework that affords them the ability to sort of pick and choose and do some things that might be really good for themselves, and also unveil why they might not have done them in the first instance, because there might have been some sort of spiritual block for them feeling like they deserve to feel good in the first instance. So everything is kind of taken care of and wrapped up in a really simple approach that's relevant to the modern world, because all the naturalists, all the biophysicists are a little bit like, let's move to Mexico and or let's go to the bush and live on a spring. Okay, that's cool, but it's not gonna serve all that many people that really need the information. So we made it really, really relevant to people that live in the modern world and wish to continue living in the modern world.
Yeah, absolutely. So who do you mainly kind of see and help at the moment?
Well, I'm a all comers practitioner, so I don't restrict anyone. So it's really very diverse. That's the truth. But the people that are capturing my interest right now are these really, really complex neurological cases in curiously young people with none of the normal instigative reasons for the significance of what they're experiencing. So there's a couple of us just putting our heads together, trying to understand what the best approach for those people may be. And my feeling is there's something really significant in there to do with the fluid body as the unifying force between them. And then once the fluid body, maybe this is all hypothetical, I don't have the answer for this. Once the fluid body is reconciled and healthy, potentially then that's the stage where the reflexes can start to be laid down, their brainstem can start to feel safe. And then, you know, the brainstem's really responsible for understanding and sifting out a whole bunch of information that comes in from just about every important sector in the body. So it makes sense to develop better and better strategies to nourish that and make that feel safe and good. And my kind of off the record shorthand for that is I think that the reason we're seeing that is because the sort of the cortical apparatus in people's brains is heavily organized in electromagnetic fields, and I think that we're seeing a really significant organic and inorganic shift to the electromagnetic environment that we're living in. And I think what we're seeing is sort of a lowering of the capacity to effect learned functional compensatory strategies that these children have learned by watching older people than them do things. But now we're exposing what's under the hood. We're starting to see what's going on in their fluid body, what's going on in their brainstem, and we may be unearthing things that are, you know, many generations in the making, environmentally and otherwise, that are now starting to come to the fore. Because for my mind, there has to be some really central, you know, ubiquitous structures involved to explain the significance of their symptoms complexes. So that's what's really interesting me right now.
Absolutely. So the complex neuro, there's just so much more of it now. But what would that look like? What would someone with that kind of presentation? Is that somebody that has a particular diagnosis, or what does that kind of present?
They're usually carrying a few oddly shaped traditional labels, and it's just been the other people's best effort to try to shape shift them into as many kind of overlapping categories as possible. But the truth is, the one thing that defines these people is that they're somewhat new in terms of how far-reaching their suffering kind of goes into multiple systems. We've got 18 to 25-year-olds now that unexplainably get restricted to bed for weeks and months, lose motor control, some instances losing speech, and then coming back and never really feeling quite the same, very fragile. So they might make a sort of a resurgence, and then something fairly innocuous sort of seems to trigger them back off. And so, yeah, like I said, there's a bunch of people kind of putting their heads together, trying really hard to develop strategies for these people so that they get their birthright, which is to feel as good as people can.
Yeah, for sure. So kind of like almost like an FND, functional neurological disorder, but then also other.
Well, I'm sure there's going to be a whole bunch of cool 3-letter acronyms emerge over the next 5 years to explain this, and I'm not sure if any of them are going to necessarily provide the solutions on the ground for the people. But let's make our acronyms, you know.
Yeah, no, for sure. So what are your kind of goals, or where do you want to go? Where do you sort of see yourself heading and looking more into?
Well, right now, I'm really enjoying having young children, and I'm very aware that that won't be the case forever. And so I'm making sure that everything that I'm doing is as harmonized as possible with my desire to spend as much time with them as possible while they're young. And then when they're all at school, okay, that might shift the sort of the focus a little bit in the day to more professional pursuits. But right now I'm still clinic facing, really enjoying that work. I'm always trying to look for new strategies for the problems that we're seeing arise, and always trying to, on a related but slightly separate path, always trying to increase medical equality by providing strategies that people can access wherever they are and whoever they are and whatever their circumstances are, so that it's not such a hierarchical opportunity for people to gain access to feeling good. And so that's the whole Biotra notion. We'd really like to see the Biotra approach reach as many people, grassroots people, normal people as possible, for them to just start to feel the invitation and the permission to start to do certain things and not do certain things and feel certain ways that might then decrease some of the burden on our practitioner system and our healthcare system, but also maybe provide some more sort of interesting roles for the people in the practitioner system. They might not be dealing with the same thing all day, every day. They might be seeing different things, and that might be a really fun kind of upward spiral. That's our dream. That's our goal, is to get that approach into as many people's hands as possible.
Yeah, beautiful. So where's your clinic located?
Well, I work out of PH Clinic in Balgowlah, and that's in Sydney, and Sydney's Northern Beaches. And then just behind me here is my lab, which is the bush at the back of my house. And this is where I do most of my movement and my training and my formulation of new things to do. So it's not too far away from my house, about a 5-minute drive. So everything's very central. Yeah.
Awesome. And if people want to learn more about everything we were talking about today, what's the best place for them to go?
You know, regrettably, there's a distinct lack of accessible and up-to-date holistic health resources for people. So there have been some tremendous ones in the past, but in my opinion, they're not strong enough on the biophysics, which is the most significant environmental adversary of right now. So if it doesn't have a really strong biophysics branch to it, it just needs to be updated. It doesn't mean the other stuff's not right. It just means that it needs to be updated. So that was really the reason we wrote the Biotra book, was to have a very up-to-date, relevant resource for people. It's very extensive. It's accessible. The font's big. You don't have to read it cover to cover, but it's nearly 500 pages long, and it's an A4 size book. Lots of drawings, lots of diagrams. It's a bit of a learning experience to try to get people that are willing to try as up to speed in as many of the various facets of health that they can be. And also there's the supporting courses with Biotra that, so say someone isn't a reader or just wants to have that as a reference book and doesn't want that to be their sole source of instruction, then there are those much shorter sort of video online course material that someone can go. And for example, Nathan's course just has 9 modules on the most salient biophysics sort of strategies that people can employ, and has a varying degree of depth from, hey, this is it, do this if that's all you want, all the way down to very, very complex explanations and references and additional resources. And in my line of work, really, then there's the OOV and the OOV education for practitioners, the OOVit app for consumers and practitioners. It's an expensive, odd book. It's not a real page turner, but if you're very interested in the spinal mechanics, Sergei Grakovetsky's Spinal Engine, I'd recommend for practitioners or sort of upper middle interested parties to read Muscles and Meridians by Philip Beach. And, you know, the list just goes on and on. Like I just, you know, almost get divorced every week by how many books arrive at my house. I love books. I love reading. There's literally weird stacks of books all around my house and in all the bookshelves. So just keep, you know, what I will say is a lot of stuff seems to be orientated around fear at the moment, especially on the more accessible platforms, the social media, the podcast world. They're very opinionated, they're very polarizing, and that's what sells, right? That's what gets it out to a broader population. So I get that. But it's also, you see this massive divide emerging between these people that are really, really afraid of being sick. And so they do this really dogmatic and sort of defensible kind of health strategy, and people really, really sick and unhealthy and unhappy on the other side, kind of, trying to dig their heels in about existing systems. So whatever you go and learn and do it with a view to compassion for yourself, what you have done, what you will do, and understanding and compassion for everybody out there that's not doing that. And just understand that it's a really individual, personal journey. And if we can all start to understand that everybody's trying their best, then that's a really nice place to start a conversation about, as opposed to, I need to fix you because, hey, did you read this? That can become a real weaponized kind of knowledge, and that's not going to help. Doesn't matter what you read, that's not going to help.
Yeah, for sure. One of my mentors said there's more than one right way to do things. And like when he said that, it's just stuck with me since then too.
Yeah, and it changes too. That right way for a certain point can become a wrong way when all the circumstances around it change. It's the yin-yang principle. And so it's really inviting back in this kind of fluid, tender, relationship-rich approach to living in a community and moving forward as a community, as opposed to as these silos of, sort of weaponized, dogmatic pockets of knowledge.
So you've got 4 movement practitioners. You do some courses, practitioner courses with the OOV.
There's really one that's kind of superseded them all now. And so for practitioners, it's been named the foundational course, but it's really a refinement of all the other courses up to this point. And it's very, very punchy. It's super fun to teach. It's super fun to receive. The feedback that we're getting is really tremendous. And it's, it's really stepped up into the way the OOV is now being used in the clinic, which really reflects all that reflex work and those sorts of things, and then providing tools to people that get stuck on their own organic journey just to sort of get them back on that path. So really stepping away from that heavy-handed kind of clinical approach and much more into the, hey, this is the organic kind of playful journey that you can go on. Oh, you appear to be stuck. No worries. We've got a really nice solution for that right now. Boom, step back, let them keep going.
Awesome. And you mentioned the OOV app. Is that something that anyone can get?
Yeah, it's available right now on all the app stores, but it's currently, as of this time, undergoing a facelift that'll be super fun, but it's still available in its rudimentary form right now. And when the facelift's taken place, it'll just be a sort of a cleaner user interface, all the same material, but a better user experience. And so that way someone can hop onto the OOV, have their own digital support wherever they are, and start to go on that journey.
Yeah. Brilliant. Any last words of wisdom from you, Nick?
No, you got to cut me off at some point. Yes, I could talk to you all day, but I feel like you hosted beautifully. I mean, those questions were tremendous. You're really natural at this, so I realize you're just starting this kind of journey, but it's going to be very valuable for a lot of people. So hats off to you. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. And thank you so much for being a guest. It's really nice to hear kind of the insights and the thoughts and what's happening, kind of where you're up to and what you're kind of exploring, particularly with biophysics and everything there, which just sounds fascinating, like a really, really cool approach.
Yeah, thank you. We can provide some nice links and resources for you, and if you're sort of keen on sort of learning more about that, we have this really epic immersion that we do once a year with all 3 of us, because Nathan, as biophysicists tend to do, lives somewhere extremely exquisite from a biophysics standpoint. So he lives in Mexico now. Nice. And even though he's an Aussie guy, so we meet once a year in November in the Solomon Islands. So if any of your people that you know well that are sort of tending to go down this path already, then there's something that I'll give you all the details for that. It's the 17th to 23rd of November in the Solomon Islands, and we go through the whole immersion, the whole course, deep in nature, with a whole bunch of other super fun additional activities too. You should come.
Awesome. Yeah. No, that kind of sounds really cool.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, nice. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. It's been amazing having a conversation with you. Yeah, and that's it.
Thank you very much. Do it again sometime.